Hello, friends. It's Mike Williams. I recently had the pleasure of joining Sean Stone for a 1-hour discussion on the Beatles, and we covered a lot of ground. And so without further ado, here's the show, and thanks for listening.
Cool. All right, Mike. So thanks for talking to me, because I've been very curious by the Beatles since reading about, not because my mom was a diehard Beatles fan, really because I had read some of Lyndon LaRouche's EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, and Dope Inc., books like that. And basically going back to the 60s, 70s time period, they were calling out the Beatles and this whole British invasion as literally a British invasion, as far as the intention of what they were considering, the propagation of mind controls, the sex, drugs, rock, basically mind control techniques of hysteria. Obviously we knew that with the Beatles, the mass hysteria created around the concerts, and the music basically changing the nature of music, moving in. I think it was like basically sort of designed to be 12 tone, but right as a 12 tone.
Yeah.
But essentially moving like the progressions into very what's called modern day pop, right? Essentially like meant to be very like catchy, hypnotic, sort of a complete break from any classical musical traditions. And obviously we know the jazz and things like this had already been around, but this was popularizing en masse certain things that even as we know, people like the Frankfurt School, like Adorno and people like that were writing about, with this concept of pop, the top 40 music that you could basically play over and over on the radio and get people to buy into that idea of like, these are the popular songs right now, and they have to be short, not like a symphony or a concerto. They've got to be like 3 minute. Right. And the Beatles fit right into that, that classification, essentially, of transforming the nature of music and how we engage with music. Obviously rock and roll had already been around and doing a similar thing, but the Beatles almost perfected it in a way that was a huge, as we know, international phenomenon. So having heard all these things from EIR and read these articles about how the Tavistock Institute, which is sort of the hub of mind control studies for the British Empire, going back to the First World War even, was very much involved in creating the Beatles. I'm very curious to start with this big question of how much were the Beatles a creation of Tavistock, let's say, in the sort of the British establishment?
Entirely. The Beatles were 100% created by Tavistock, as well as the entire British invasion, Sean, and all genres of music that followed. Each genre of music has an agenda. There's a point that they're trying to drive home, that they're trying to condition people with, in order to move their agenda forward. And the agenda is social engineering. It was to move away from what most people would call the traditional values, especially with regard to Christianity. And so the Beatles really kicked that off. And we can argue that it went before the Beatles with Elvis and so on, but the big push with the British invasion started with the Beatles. So the Beatles were 100% a creation of Tavistock.
Great. So how do we get to that? Let's start with your investigation, really. How do you get to that conclusion? Give us some of the major elements that you've discovered along the way.
Well, the first piece of it is that there is an agenda. So there is a one world initiative, and it is based in Aleister Crowley's Aeon of Horus. Other people will know it as the Age of Aquarius, the New Age, pick your terminology, but it's really based in Crowley's Aeon of Horus. And so the controllers, in order to make the Aeon of Horus a reality, to push it forward, they needed to have tools, big tools, in order to change the very fabric of our culture and our societies. And so they had the Beatles on the radar for a very long time. Now, some people will ask me, at what point do you think the Beatles became a product of Tavistock? And my answer is 1960 for sure, when they were in Hamburg. But I believe it's possible that it goes even beyond that, that the Beatles themselves, and specifically biological Paul McCartney and John Lennon, may have been, and I say may have been, in mind control programs. And they were handled and brought along. And you know how this works. There's this whole grooming process that takes place. And so Tavistock put them together, and there were three phases of the Beatles. There was the Hamburg Beatles, which included Stu Sutcliffe and Pete Best. And then the 62 to 66 Beatles, where we had John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, biological Paul McCartney. And phase three was the Billy period, the Billy Shears period, where Billy playing the part of Paul, John, George, and Ringo. So
we'll get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Yeah. So the Beatles were put in place in order to break down the cultural and societal norms at the time. And they did it in a way that was very methodical. It was very incremental. For many people, it wasn't very shocking. Maybe to the adults, to the older folks it was, but for the younger folks, the younger generation, no, they just soaked it right up. And it was to pull people away from the societal structures that their parents were accustomed to. And that was the beginning, the very beginning of the 1960s is when Crowley's Eon of Horus was, in my opinion, being pushed very hard going forward. And now it's 60 years later.
And well, in terms of Crowley, we know that he was featured on the was it Sgt. Pepper's album as one of the people that they like, right? In the background, it's clear that Crowley's there. So in terms of how do Crowley is itself a huge story, as we know, because he connects with, he does have elements of intelligence. It does seem he's a British intelligence operative, but obviously influencing huge amounts of people with his magic, his creation of OTO, and that becomes global. But without getting too much into that story yet, just in terms of how do we know Tavistock is directly involved with the creation of the Beatles, and whether it's songwriting and deployment of them up to the States?
Yeah, so there's not going to be anything, official documents out there that are going to say, with Tavistock letterhead on it, right? Signed by somebody in Tavistock to say, hey, this is what we did, or this is what we're planning on doing. So for me, it was a matter, Sean, of understanding the deep state and understanding how it operates, and knowing that Tavistock is a big piece of the deep state apparatus, and it can't be understated, right? They're tucked in under the Committee of 300, and so they are responsible for, and there's books that have been written on this, right? So if folks want to research it, there are some very good books on what Tavistock is all about, and I don't mean books that align with their website, which makes it seem very, very pleasant. But that's how I did it. I had to dig in and understand the deep state and the mechanics of the deep state, the parts, the piece parts of who's there. There's Tavistock, there's the Club of Rome, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. I mean, you know who all these players are. I know you do. And so once you understand who these players are and who these organizations are, Stanford Research Institute, as an example, is another one, then you can start to settle in and you can begin to figure out who's doing what within that machine. And the Beatles and this type of social engineering comes in under the purview of Tavistock.
And so when you're looking, I know you've done a huge 4-hour talk about who wrote the music, and I think you go deeper into each of the song, like, well, the main, let's say the songs, not every one necessarily, but the main songs, and how how these were constructed. But what is the intentionality of of what they were doing? Let's just talk about that. The book Memoirs of Billy Shears, we can start talking about as well, because that's a fascinating component. they talk about how the Beatles basically were painted as sort of the good kids, and the Rolling Stones were deployed as sort of the bad kids, like they were more satanic by dark, and the Beatles were like the good boys, you know, with their mop cuts or whatever you call that haircut. And so what was the intentionality with the Beatles, and how, you know, and how they were positioned and what they were meant to do, in the sense of what the music was meant to do?
Yeah, so they were positioned as the good boys of rock and roll, and where the Stones were the bad boys. But both of them had identical agendas. So the Beatles appealed to one faction of the population and the Stones to another. But those two factions, think of them as like work streams, they converge and they come together at the end. So what they were looking to do with the Beatles, with their mop tops and the different style of music, the way they spoke during interviews, where, you know, they would joke around, they would make social commentary, where they were, in a lot of the early interviews, you can see as time went on, where they were basically pushing back at the establishment. Like establishment reporters would be asking questions, and then they would get like smart alecky. And so what was happening there, that's just that's conditioning. That's to get the young minds, the teenagers, to watch that and start to think, hey, you know, I'm going to emulate what they're doing here. How I like the music, I like their haircuts, I like the way they dress. And then, you know, when the Beatles got into the whole psychedelic era, the introduction of drugs, drug use, the Monterey Pop Festival, which, by the way, Billy was instrumental in putting together, even though he didn't play there. So that's what they were doing. So it was giving a picture, a very different picture, to a worldwide audience, to a lifestyle, music, a way of speaking, a way of conducting yourself that was very different than what people were accustomed to, especially the generation before, the mothers and fathers of the population, the kids that were front and center with the whole Beatles scene. So it's the thing that people have to understand is that it was very calculated, it was very strategic, it was very methodical, and it was very incremental, but it was steady. It was a steady stream of this stuff being pumped out. It was mind control. It was social engineering. And so if you didn't take to the Beatles and you became a Stones fan, it was the same thing. Now the Stones are on the other end, you know, with, like we said, they were the bad boys. But at the end of the day, both roads converge. So they had Tavistock, and the controlling apparatus had all of its bases covered. And of course, and if you weren't a Beatles or a Stones fan, then you would like the Who, or you'd like the Kinks. You know, they had something for everybody. And then we had the advent of Led Zeppelin in the 1970s. We had that's when Kiss hit the scene. So right, so that's what they were doing. They were social engineering, and they were doing it through the music and through the media. And what I tell my audience, Sean, is that the music and entertainment industry are controlled end to end, cradle to grave. And those two industries especially are gigantic tools in the toolbox of the controllers. They can get an awful lot done through the music and the entertainment industry. And most people are completely unaware. They just soak it up.
Exactly. It's social. Exactly. It's social engineering. It's a simple way of putting it. So let's get into this. Paul is dead. This is really fascinating because I remember hearing that as a kid as well, that there was a conspiracy theory that Paul McCartney died in what, 67 was it?
66, September of 66.
66, yeah. And then on that album cover was Abbey Road, where they're walking, the four are walking, and that was can't remember, something about that. Either it was the first time that you saw Billy Shears, or there was something about the album cover that was.
Yeah, he was walking barefoot, and
oh, that's
right. And they were saying that the way they were walking We had John Lennon dressed in white as God. You know, Billy was the deceased. George Harrison was in denim, so he was the Undertaker, and George was, Ringo was dressed like a priest or a pastor, right? So that was the overview of what Abbey Road was representing to the to the basic Paul is dead person.
Right. So it was meant to kind of indicate symbolically that.
Right.
So tell us about this theory. You know, if we how we believe, why we believe that Paul did die, and how he was replaced by someone that looked, I guess, identical to him. I mean, essentially it's
Similar.
It's pretty close, right? Okay.
Yeah. So when you take a really close look, you can see that they are not the same person. So they have different facial features. Billy's face is longer. He's taller, and just the way his face is structured. If you take a really good look at it and you do the comparisons, you can see that they're not the same person. But Billy underwent a number of surgeries to create the McCartney look, along with using cosmetics like latex, especially later on, as time went on during his Wings era, especially. And what they tried to do, Sean, and I'll get into the replacement of Paul, but this is a good point that I need to make. What they did, first of all, Billy has the primary contract. He's the primary replacement. So what that means is there are doubles and lookalikes that have been deployed throughout the timeline. Ever since the very beginning, when the Beatles were first created, they had doubles and lookalikes. And so what Tavistock did, what the controllers did, was to establish a composite Paul McCartney. So if you looked at Paul McCartney over a timeline, and I did this, I built a collage or a montage of what Paul McCartney looked like at different points, different years, you could see he's a different person, or he looks very different from biological Paul McCartney. But without doing that analysis, what happens is people just see Paul McCartney because he's a composite character at this point in time. And it was done in order to keep people from making the comparison, because so many years have gone by. He's been doing this now for 56 years, along with lookalikes and doubles. And so you have this character of Paul McCartney. So what happened? The conspiracy says, although Memoirs has backed off this and is alluding to a ritual sacrifice more with the latest edition of the book, which was the 2021 version. But the prevailing conspiracy is that biological Paul McCartney died in a car crash. And you'll hear different dates. Some people will say it's August of 1966. Others will say it was September 11th of 66. I believe it was September 11th because of its importance to the occult. And some folks believe it was November 9th. So another version of 9/11. And he died in his car crash, and then they replaced him. And the person that ended up getting the nod was Billy Shears. In the book, he tells us his name is William Shepard, but I'm not convinced that his last name is Shepard. Other people believe his last name is Campbell, but I don't major on that, because whether it's Shepard or Campbell, he's a different guy, right? So, and that's why I call him Billy Shears, because that's what he calls himself. So that's the basic explanation of what happened. Biological Paul McCartney died in a car crash. It happened on September 11th, and a replacement was found. But it wasn't just a replacement was found. It gets much deeper than that, because based upon my research, Billy has been in the pipeline for a long time, going back to as early as 1962. He just didn't appear in 1966. They just didn't pick him out of a lineup and say, yeah, you'll do. They had to make sure that they had somebody in place that could be the band's handler, because that's really what he became. He became the band's handler as soon as he took the reins in late 1966. And he worked very closely with George Martin. And George Martin had a very important role in all of this, along with Theodore Adorno.
Okay. And who was George Martin?
George Martin was the Beatles producer, and many times he's referred to as the fifth Beatle.
Mm-hmm.
And Theodore Adorno was with the Frankfurt School, Stanford Research Institute. He worked closely with Willis Harman, who was another social scientist that was involved in this whole Beatles psychological operation, this initiative. And some people believe that Theo Adorno wrote all of the music. I don't subscribe to that. I believe that the way it was structured, Theodore Adorno, who was reporting directly into Tavistock, was heavily involved with the music, but I think he was overseeing it. And I'm not saying he didn't write some of the music, because Theodore Adorno was a very accomplished musician, composer. So it's very, very possible that he did write some of the music, but I don't think he wrote all of it, as some claim. I also believe George Martin was also contributing to the songwriting. And between Theodore Adorno and George Martin, they had a kludge of songwriters that they were working with, maybe about a half dozen at most, professional songwriters that were either on the Tavistock or the EMI. EMI was the label the Beatles were signed to, EMI Parlophone, on staff that were writing the music. And I believe Billy he may have been a part of that kludge of 5 or 6 songwriters that were writing the music back during the 1962 through 1966 period. So the point I'm making is I do believe that Billy has been in the game for a lot longer than many people who were in the Paul is Dead research community believe. He made a comment about 2 years ago where he said that he wrote the music to the song In My Life, which is a song that goes back to the 1962 through 66 period. And that song is credited to John Lennon. It's always been considered a John Lennon song. John Lennon sings it, but Billy came out and said he wrote the music and John wrote the lyrics. And when that article came out, the mainstream media went into damage control. And they came out and said, well, 2 universities ran these computer models, and the computer models point to John Lennon. So Paul McCartney misremembered. Well, you don't misremember writing a song like In My Life, which is one of the top rock and roll songs of all time. So if you take a look at any major rock and roll poll and you look at the greatest songs of all time, you're going to see In My Life at the top of that list. And you just don't misremember. So I think what Billy was doing, because this is what he's doing with Memoirs, Sean, is he's dropping these clues. And those who are intrepid enough will take a look at them and investigate them and try to figure out what's going on. So I think he was telling us, I was there back then. And that is my song. I did write the music to that. But going back to his, Paul dying, the car crash, like I said, is the common discussion point of how he died. But Memoirs is getting a lot darker as far as telling the story of what really happened. And it had to do with Faustian bargain, the deal with the devil.
So a sacrifice, essentially.
Sacrifice, yeah, ritual sacrifice. And Memoirs tells us that ritual sacrifice took place on October 24th of 1963. And with that pact, it was John Lennon and Paul McCartney that entered into that pact. And Memoirs refers to it as death for success. And of course, they're told that they will see incredible levels of fame and fortune, immortality from the standpoint of the music will live on forever. And in 1963, John Lennon was 23 years old and biological Paul McCartney was 21. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, did they even know what it is they were getting themselves into? And I'm going to say that they did not. I don't believe they did. So that's what it was from what Memoirs is telling us. And I've done a lot of research, Sean, into the music business and the entertainment industry. And we see these ritual sacrifices all the time. And it's very difficult for a lot of people to get their heads around because they just don't think it happens. They just think this is wacky, crazy conspiracy stuff. But I mean, look at Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones.
I was actually going to bring that up as sort of, was that a comparable sacrifice that took place? Was Jones sacrificed for essentially making a pact? Because I thought he left the band at that point. So what do you think that murder was about?
Yeah, I think that was the pact, and whether you leave the band later or not, I don't even know if that's relevant. The sacrifices are done, and it's earmarked for a specific event or a specific agenda item that they have. In that case, it was the Rolling Stones. And biological Paul McCartney, it was the Beatles. We had John Bonham with Led Zeppelin. A lot of people don't know that Robert Plant almost died. He had a very serious situation as well. So, and we could talk about the 27 Club, which I know you know all about, and we can go on and on and on and on. So, for at least from my perspective and my research, the Faustian bargain is real. It takes place, and it really doesn't matter. This is what I tell my audience when I talk about this. It doesn't really matter what we believe. What matters is what the people who control believe.
Sure.
That's right. And I think that's a key way to delineate it, because a lot of people are like, well, I don't believe that, so I'll just take that off the table. Well, you're not running things either.
Yeah, I totally get it. In terms of the memoirs of Billy Shears, this is it's a dense book with a lot of insight and information. Do you have any intelligence on what the origin is of that? As far as, we know Tom Harriet, presents it. Is it something that you believe like he has personal awareness of the story, and or is he basically presenting did he actually write it, or did he present it from someone else? I mean, what is your take on that memoir?
All right, so I'll give you my take on it, and it's based upon some things that I pulled together. First of all, Tom is a Freemason, okay, and so we'll put that out there, because Billy is not going to engage and contract with somebody who's not in the Brotherhood for something like this. It's just not going to happen. And just so everybody knows, I don't work with Tom. I don't work for Billy. Over the years, it's been 6 years now, Tom and I have a professional acquaintance with each other. So I respect the work that he does. I believe he respects the work that I do. And that's really the level that it stays at. We communicate periodically, and the communications have to do mostly with me asking specific questions about certain passages in the book. That it's not a friendship where we're going out for beers and all that stuff. So that being said, going back about 5 years ago, I had asked Tom about a particular passage in Memoirs. It had to do with Denny Lane and the Diplomats. And in the book, Billy says that he played the original character of Phil Ackrell, who was in the band with Denny at the time. And that's where we get the Denny Lane, Paul McCartney tie. It goes back to the days of the Diplomats. So there was a passage in the book, and I must have read it, Sean, about 10 times. I'm like, what is he saying here? It was one of those things where it can go this way or it can go that way. So I wrote Tom an email, and I said, this sentence or two or three about the Diplomats, am I reading this correctly? I said, because it's not tying out. And he wrote me back, and he said, well, that's the way it's supposed to be written, Mike. He says, basically the book is like a big puzzle, and it's not going to give you everything straight as an arrow. It's layered. It has layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. It's 3 layers to the book. So I asked him the question, and he said, let me go back to the boxes and the files I have, and let me take a look at what I can find to help me answer the question. So that was very interesting. So I don't know whether, Tom slipped, or whether Tom said that intentionally as a way to let me know that he had incoming. So he received content to work with, right? So there are some folks that believe that Tom is just somebody that hangs around on Paul is Dead forums and put this book together. And I believe what really happened is the Masonic structure is set up like a corporation. And so whenever there's an initiative or an agenda that needs to get done, it seeks out the best resources and skills within that structure to do the work. Tom told me that, and he didn't say when, but I'm going to assume it was, when he was younger. I don't think it was last week. He was taught how to encode. And he said to me, Mike, at the time, I had no idea why I was learning this, but I was taught how to encode. And so Tom had these encoding skills. And so when Billy and whoever else was involved in deciding to finally release the book back in September 9th of 2009, before they even got there, they selected their resources. So there's a vetting process, and Tom was tapped because he had these encoding skills. So the interesting thing is Tom is not referred to as the author. This is a very interesting delineation. He's referred to as the encoder. So if he's not the author, then who is the author of the book if he's primarily identified as the encoder? Because the book is encoded. So I do believe, I'm convinced that Billy is directly involved with the book, because the level of information in the book, Sean, the details could only be known by somebody that was there, somebody who witnessed the events, took part in the events. The other thing is Tom uses song lyrics in the song, Beatles song lyrics. And you cannot use song lyrics unless you have permission from the owner of the copyright. Otherwise, you run the risk of being sued. There's litigation
Is that right?
come your way. Yes. Yep.
Publishing, you can't even quote.
You can't. I mean, if you want to try it, you could do it. I ran this by two attorneys. One is an attorney I work with who does intellectual property, and another attorney who's a friend of mine who does criminal law. And I ran it by them. I said, can you just take lyrics to a song and just pop them into the book and use them? And both of them came back and said, we do not advise that, because the copyright owner can turn around and either issue a cease and desist, or you can wind up getting sued. I also had somebody within the music industry, a very accomplished person within the music industry, reach out to me. And in fact, I was working with them a bit when I did my big presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music, which I released back in April of 2020. And he's a songwriter. And he told me the exact same thing. And this is before I ran it by the attorneys. And so no, you cannot just use lyrics and expect that it's fair use. And like I said, you could try it.
Yeah. Well, did you have any issue with it, with using it when you were doing your presentation?
Using what, the song lyrics?
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I really didn't use song lyrics in the presentation. I played snippets of songs and whatnot, under fair use. But I'm talking about actually putting the lyrics in the book, because the issue that a copyright owner or the owner of the rights would have is, how are you using my material? Are you using the material in a way that is good for me, benefits me as the owner of the rights? Or are you doing something that's going to tarnish or taint my work?
Okay.
Okay, so if you're going to put it in a video, I guess there is some difference there, but I was told if you're going to write a book and do that, you have to be very careful, and you should go get permission to do that. The other thing is, on the inner cover of the book, Tom uses Billy's likeness, and that could also present legal issues. Both attorneys came back to me and said that one is a little borderline. You might be able to use the likeness, but
Well, because presumably there is no Billy Shears, right? Have we ever confirmed a record of Billy Shears before he became Paul McCartney?
No, no. Billy Shears is just a stage name, right? But the thing is, he's got him as Paul McCartney, and he calls him Sir Paul McCartney in the book.
Mm.
You see, so so when you get to that level with that type of celebrity status as a quote Paul McCartney, even using the likeness could wind up being a legal issue. Depending upon how that person feels about you using their likeness.
Right.
So the reason why I'm saying all this is because in order for all this to come together, Billy had to be directly involved with the book. Tom put the book together. Tom is encoding the book, but they are working together. And back a number of years ago, Tom told me that there were a number of projects underway that were going to be rolled out as Billy got closer and closer to the end of his runway and he departs this world. And we actually have seen that taking place now since 2009, it's really when it started, but over the last 2 or 3 years with the Hulu special, Peter Jackson's Get Back. He released the lyrics, 1956 to present. He's releasing a book this November called Legacy. There was the movie Yesterday, which is loaded up with Paul is Dead clues. So there's a lot of activity taking place. Yeah.
Tell us some of the clues that were in Yesterday.
Oh, well, just the whole premise that this guy that was winds up in an alternate reality and starts playing Beatles songs and becomes famous because people think that he wrote these songs.
Right.
Right. Just the basic premise of the movie is Paul is Dead. So if you take a look at Billy, who was a session musician, an accomplished session musician, before he took over the role, nobody knew who he was. And then when he took on the role of Paul McCartney, he was in a different reality now. He was experiencing all this fame and fortune playing the character of Paul McCartney. So the parallels between that movie Yesterday and the Paul is Dead narrative, they tie together.
But one question people would always have to ask is why, if Paul had died, not just say Paul is dead and we're replacing him. I mean, we've seen that with other bands, right? When someone drops out, passes away.
Yeah. Why didn't they just announce that this is the new guy, right?
Yeah.
That's a question that gets asked a lot. I think it's because, Sean, that in the book, it alludes very strongly to Billy being the son of Aleister Crowley. And it's not definitive, so I don't want to say the book is saying it outright, but there are a lot of clues. So when Sgt. Pepper came out, it said 20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band how to play. So Crowley died in 1947. 1967, we have Sgt. Pepper. And as you mentioned, Crowley is on the cover of Pepper. So the reason why they did this was because this was a special case, because the Beatles were directly linked and tied to Crowley's Aeon of Horus. So it wasn't good enough just to replace him with somebody else. They replaced him with a person that was knee deep in the philosophy of Crowley, in Thelema, the Luciferian philosophy. So they replaced him basically with somebody that was going to lead the charge from a music perspective, from when we talk about the music industry, to take the Aeon of Horus forward. And they just couldn't pick just somebody to do that. They had to pick somebody that was going to be very, very popular, and they actually set it up so that Paul McCartney becomes a graven Christ figure, right? He died and was resurrected through Billy. And they're aligning this, believe it or not, in the book. They're telling us now, people are going to think this is absolutely nuts, but they're lining this up so that Paul McCartney, many, many years from now, is a godhead, presented as a God figure of the new one world religion.
Mm.
And as crazy as that sounds, and trust me, folks, when I read it, I'm like, this is crazy, but this is what they're doing. And it all goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. And
Yeah. Well, you say Christ. I mean, that's Horus. Horus is the resurrection.
exactly.
Who dies, and basically Horus becomes, they reconstruct Horus as Osiris, as the child, and then Crowley referred to it as the age of the child. And what were the Beatles about? They were the kids who were there basically to influence the young generation.
Exactly.
Generation. So very, very interesting symbologies.
It runs very deep, Sean. It's impossible to even cover it all.
Yes. No, I totally get that. So in terms of Lennon's death, it seems that the guy was MK Ultra, and he was there with that famous book, right? That so many of these assassins carry, the Catcher in the Rye, right?
Yeah.
By a former intelligence operative, or he was just an intelligence operative himself, the author of that book. Which is full of, as my friend Joseph Atwill has decoded a lot of that actually in the paper. Have you read Atwill's paper about Catcher in the Rye? And
no, I haven't read it.
Oh, the whole hunting cap and everything. It's like, if you read it, it's symbolically, it sounds like he's killing people, basically, the main character when he's out there. There's language and whatnot that you can interpret as actually it is about a mass shooting, but it doesn't come across that way if you read it benevolently. But if you actually decode it a little bit, it looks like it actually comes across as a template for a mass shooting.
Yeah. It's another book that's layered. And Jose Perdomo was the doorman that night at the Dakota, and Jose was part of Operation 40, which was the U.S. assassination squad.
That's right.
So what was he doing as the doorman that night?
Wow. Yeah.
And the theory is that it was actually Perdomo who shot John Lennon and then handed it over to Mark David Chapman, who was the patsy.
He was just sitting there, wasn't he? Waiting for that.
Yeah. He was looking to get something signed, a book signed.
Yeah.
So the way it went down, we have to ask ourselves, why was Jose the doorman?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think he probably could have had better work than being a doorman.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating. That would definitely make a lot of sense. Someone like Chapman just kind of being the patsy, kind of like with Son of Sam Berkowitz.
Yes. Yeah.
Situation, guys that are mentally disturbed and able to be put into, hypnotic states.
Well, there were multiple shooters too with the Son of Sam.
Oh,
murders, right? Yeah.
We covered that with Best Kept Secret, and there's a lot of good guys that, Maury Terry and others that have covered this over the years. So with Lennon, do you feel like that was he deviating at all from the program, or do you think that he was consistently part of the agenda to the end?
John Lennon there were cracks in the dam with John Lennon, also with George Harrison. So in a number of interviews, after the Beatles broke up, Lennon, he did an interview with Rolling Stone. He did interviews with Playboy, and he was talking about the Beatles myth, the McCartney myth, the Dylan myth. So, at the time when I used to listen to these interviews or read them, it just didn't click with me. But now I go back and I read these interviews, and it's obvious that John Lennon was pushing stuff out there. I mean, when he sang the song God off his first solo album, at the very end of the song, he's singing, I don't believe in this, I don't believe in that. And he gets to the very end and he says, I don't believe in Beatles. And he sang the song, How Do You Sleep, which was a direct attack on Billy. And that song just loaded up with Paul is Dead clues. So I think John was a bit of a loose cannon in the minds of the controllers. In the beginning, the Beatles were told that they had to do certain things, like they had to disavow Christianity. They were going to come from a more agnostic perspective. And I don't think that, I think as time went on, John Lennon, especially George Harrison as well, started to see that this was a lot bigger than they thought it was, and they were starting to see the impacts. And I think with John Lennon, once biological Paul was taken out, that was a game changer for him. Trying to keep your head in the game when something like that goes down. So I think John Lennon was letting too much out of the bag, and he was trying to do it masterfully, but he was, at sometimes it just wasn't very masterful. I mean, he just basically was saying things that would get him in trouble, and that's my personal opinion. And there was a lot of head banging between George and Billy for like 10 years after the Beatles broke up, maybe more. And you can see there was a lot of resentment there between George and Billy. And we can actually see a piece of that when we go back to the Let It Be movie and Peter Jackson's Get Back. We have that dialogue between the two of them. And Billy's trying to show him what to do here and what to do there. And George gets annoyed and says, I'll play whatever you want me to play, whatever pleases you, or I won't play at all. So we had the cracks early on, even during the time period when the Beatles were together. The White Album sessions were notorious for things not going very well. In fact, George Martin, who was their producer, walked out, and he went on vacation, and he left. But yeah, so to answer your question specifically about Lennon, I think that John was dropping clues, and he did participate in the pact back in October of 1963. So, he probably wasn't thinking in terms of his days being numbered. I think when you do those pacts, Sean, I'm convinced that you're not ever told what's going to happen or when.
Right. Oh, I'm sure. No, well, it's interesting. I mean, just the Beatles come up recently because I saw that Julian Lennon, who said he would never sing his father's songs unless it was the end of the world, has decided that now it's the end of the world because the Russian war with Ukraine is the end of the world, and just continuing exactly on this same narrative, right? That this is the worst atrocity we've seen in our lifetimes. I mean, it's so insane.
It is.
The psychology of these people.
Well, what's interesting is if you give them enough time, even those that you think are, not playing in the game, in the agenda,
they reveal themselves.
That's right. Sooner or later, they just pop up, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing this now in spades everywhere.
Yes, exactly. So is there anything else you want to share in terms of maybe your more recent interests or research when it comes to the Beatles?
Well, what I did that big piece of work, whether they wrote all their own music. And like I said, that goes back 2 years ago. And, that shook a lot of people, especially people even in the Paul is Dead community, because like I think I mentioned before we got started here, that a lot of Paul is Dead researchers, they focus on the replacement of Paul McCartney with Billy. So they basically start in 1966 and then they move forward, but they don't touch the entire story. They don't go back to the origins of the Beatles. So they don't talk about the period between 1962 and 66. They don't talk about the period between 1960 and 1963. So remember I mentioned there was 3 phases. So, starting in 1960, that would be phase 1, 62 to 66 would be phase 2, and then 67 to 70 is phase 3 when Billy was there. So I've got a presentation that's going to premiere tomorrow, and I take a deep dive into the 1960 through 1963 period to show, at least I believe I'm showing, I let my audience decide for themselves, that the Beatles were not writing their own music, that the music was written for them. They weren't on the recorded tracks, especially between 62 and 1966. They were studio musicians. Outside songwriters, ghostwriters were used from 67 to 70 as well, but as well as studio musicians, but the Beatles themselves were contributing more of their own material during that period, 67 to 70, and playing on some of the recorded tracks. But people don't realize that the music industry in the 1960s, 1970s, used a model that I refer to as the wrecking crew model. And the wrecking crew was a loose collection of professional musicians, studio musicians that performed on thousands of pop records in the United States. Sonny and Cher, the Monkees, and the list goes on and on and on. And the Beatles were no exception to that, because the music industry is a business. And if we go back into the Beatles' early time period, I don't see any indication or any tangible evidence that the Beatles were writing songs or that they were prolifically writing songs at all. And their musicianship during that period, when you hear them playing live and all that, it's not the same musicianship that's on the records. When you're listening to the recorded tracks on the albums, you're listening to studio musicians. Just quickly, I don't know how much time you have here, but George Martin admits that he hired Andy White to play on 2 songs. In the early days, it was Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. Andy White was a professional studio musician. I don't believe George Martin hired him for 2 songs. Probably hired him to do the entire Please Please Me album, which was their debut album, which was released on March 22nd, Sean, of 1963. 3-2-2. Okay. And we have Bernard Purdie, who drummed for Aretha Franklin for 25 years. He came out in the 1970s and has never backed off this statement that he drummed on 21 early Beatles songs. 21. And he wrote a book in 2014 called Let the Drums Speak. He has an entire chapter dedicated to the Ringo Starr controversy, where Bernard came out and said that he drummed on 21 songs. There was another great drummer back in the day, Ronnie Verrill, and I was contacted by a family member of Ronnie. And after I released my presentation, the big one, about whether the Beatles wrote all their own music, she contacted me and she said, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, just to let you know, Ronnie also drums on Beatles songs. Okay. And then we have Vic Flick, great guitar player, one of the best, was in the George Martin Orchestra. He was the guitar player on Ringo's theme in A Hard Day's Night. That was his guitar work. And on the US release of Help, we have the James Bond sounding music before we get to Help, the actual song Help. That was Vic Flick.
Right.
So I believe that Vic Flick played a very prominent role on many of the recordings, along with Big Jim Sullivan. Big Jim Sullivan was another in-demand session guitarist in the 1960s in England and the UK. He was also an accomplished sitar player. So I believe it's Big Jim. It's likely, I should say possible, I can't be definitive about it, was the sitar player on the Beatles song Norwegian Wood. It wasn't George Harrison. So there were other names out there. A lot of people don't realize that Jimmy Page was a session musician. And
oh wow.
Yep. Jimmy started session work at the age of 17.
And that's how they would get drafted into this kind of thing, right? They would basically be deployed because they'd be brought in as part of the arsenal, essentially. Right?
Yeah. So what they did was they were using the wrecking crew model, where they had session musicians come in. In fact, the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds album, a lot of people think it's the Beach Boys playing on that album. It is not. It's the entire album is the wrecking crew. But what happened after the 70s, because the wrecking crew model was in place here in the States and also across the pond in England and the UK. What happened after that was many of these session players, they then created their own bands. So they were actually in the band. So we had these great guitarists, these great drummers and bass players and keyboard players. Now they were in the band versus being called in just to come into the studio and record the record. Now they were actually doing both, in the band and recording. So it shifted up, I would say, starting in 1980. And a great documentary for people to watch. Well, there's 2 great documentaries. The first one is The Wrecking Crew. It's unbelievable. If you can watch that, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. And the other one is Hired Gun, which explains how the music industry worked from 1980 to current day. So I probably went on a lot longer than you wanted me to.
Oh, perfect.
I could just,
Not at
I
all.
could just rattle this stuff off. But yeah, so that's what I'm doing now. I have another presentation that's coming out, and I'm pulling out all of the occult and esoteric footnotes out of Memoirs, and I'm tying it back to Crowley. So I don't know when I'm going to have that done. It's a big piece of work, but
To connect into Crowley, you say?
yeah, back to the Eon of Horus, because without understanding Crowley and the tenets of Thelema and pursuing your true will and, you know, the OTO, as you mentioned before, and all of that, it's very difficult to pull this stuff together, because you're not tying it out. You've got to tie it out. There's a beginning, there's a middle, and then there's an end state. You know, and if you don't understand the philosophy, the ideology that set this thing off, then you're really not going to get what's really going on. Because everything that's going on in the world today, I can tie back to his tenets, his principles, his philosophy, his ideology.
Right. That's I think really a major story. So I look forward to seeing what you produce on that. So that'll be like a book you'll publish?
Presentation I do, or everything I do is video presentation.
Yeah.
So I've made a lot of headway, but maybe within the next month or so, I'll have that up on my channel.
That'd be fantastic. I'd love to see that. Because again, Crowley is so connected and so layered, you know, as far as his connections are concerned. And again, like the nature of what he was, so many theories, you know, abound, whether or not he really did practice the ritual sacrifice that he writes about, whether or not he, you know, was actually buggering children, or, you know, just talking about these things. I mean, there's so much mystery right around the mythology that he actually helped to craft around himself too, intentionally. But ultimately with Crowley, I believe that he achieved some level of transcendence of death, because I do believe that he's still very much worshipped as sort of a patriarch, as sort of you know, as an emblem of a lot of these darker magicians. You know, they still draw upon him. I think that I've heard that they even conjure him into rituals and things like this. So he definitely transcends the early 20th century when he lived. I think he's still very relevant to this day.
Well, they made him a pop icon. So the music and entertainment industry, he's embedded.
Yeah. And the other character that I would suggest looking into is Michael Jackson. Because I'm told that Jackson was fascinated not just by the Beatles, but I think he bought the original publishing right for the Beatles. And he also, I think, had what looks like Crowley, as you know, on his Dangerous album cover.
Okay, I'll take a look at that.
And a suit on the Dangerous album cover that looks like Crowley.
Yeah.
And it may be an homage to the Sgt. Pepper thing. And then, speaking of which, have you come across any of the rumors around black magic involved in the pressing of the records?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's theories that they are, for lack of a better term, blessed. Number one, right? But just the backmasking in the songs, there's a lot of backmasking.
Did John Lennon figure that one out? Wasn't that from the Beatles, the first group to intentionally encode words that when you play the record backwards?
Well, the Beatles, I believe the Beatles were the first, to encode backmasking. Well, and playing backwards in general, there's backwards guitar tracks and stuff like that. So that's another concept of that emerges with Crowley, right? Doing things backwards. The law of reversal. And I have a clip actually of Billy in an interview explaining that he was taught to write backwards. Very interesting clip. And he's explaining it like, well, when I was younger, I was taught how to write backwards. But we have the backmasking, Sean, and the backmasking is in the Beatles songs. There's lots of it. It mentions Paul being dead. If folks do this, if you have the Beatles song, Let It Be, play it backwards, and you're going to hear he be dead, he's dead, he be dead, he's dead. It's very clear. It's not something you have to kind of like, well, I think he's saying that. No, it's what he's saying. The other famous one is if you play Stairway to Heaven backwards, because Jimmy Page was huge, still is, into Crowley, as was Brian Jones, by the way. A lot of people don't know that. Brian Jones also was a fan of Crowley. But yeah, the backmasking is in many, many songs. It's still done today, although I don't spend a lot of time, Sean, listening to the music today, so I wouldn't be playing those songs backwards. But you know, that is the magic that is in the songs. And again, that ties back to Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, exactly. All right, great. Well, we look forward to the presentation. And yeah, thank you for your time for talking.
Oh, you're very welcome.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me on.